Billionaires are supposed to be easily identifiable by their tailored suits, private jets, and an aura of untouchable arrogance. They certainly aren't supposed to look like a woman shivering under the harsh fluorescent lights of a gas station at 2 a.m., desperately begging the cashier for a phone charger. Ariston had absolutely no desire to play the savior. He just desperately wanted to go to bed. The bell above the gas station door didn't ring. It choked out a metallic rattle. Ariston pushed through, dragging his left leg slightly. 12 hours on the concrete floor of the fulfillment center did that. It settled into the joints, a dull, throbbing ache that felt less like fatigue and more like rust. The air inside smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. He walked straight to the cooler in the back. The compressor hummed loudly, vibrating through the thin soles of his work boots. He grabbed a gallon of whole milk. The plastic handle was cold and wet. He needed eggs too, but eggs were a luxury for tomorrow. Tonight, it was milk and a box of generic store-brand cereal. Maya liked the ones with the fake marshmallows. They tasted like chalk, but she was 6, and she didn't know the difference between cheap sugar and the real thing. Ariston walked to the register. He pulled his hand from his jacket pocket. His fingers were stiff. He laid the bills on the scratched glass counter. 2 5s, 3 1s. Then, the coins. Quarters mostly. A few nickels smeared with something sticky he didn't want to identify. He had exactly $18.45 to his name. Payday wasn't until Friday. Today was Tuesday. Just the milk and the cereal, Dave. Ariston mumbled to the cashier, a teenager with severe acne and a name tag that read manager. As Dave slowly scanned the items, Ariston heard the voice. It was thin, strained, and stripped of whatever dignity it usually carried. Please, I just need to use the landline or a charger. I have money. I don't have it on me. Ariston turned his head. Standing near the spinning rack of stale pastries was a woman. She looked out of place, but not in the way rich people usually did. Her clothes were a mess. A wool coat, drenched and heavy with rain, clung to her shoulders. One of the heels on her leather boots was snapped clean off, making her stand lopsided. Her hair, dark and plastered to her cheeks, dripped onto the linoleum. "Lady, I told you," Dave said, snapping his gum. "Phones for employees. No public charger. You got to buy something or you got to leave. No loitering." "I was run off the road," she said, her voice catching. Not a cry, but the frantic, shallow breath of someone running on pure adrenaline. "My car is in a ditch 3 miles back on Route 9. My purse was on the passenger seat. I don't know where my phone went when we hit the embankment. Please." Ariston looked at her. Really looked. There was a smear of grease on her jaw. Her eyes were wide, the whites stark against the pale, freezing color of her skin. "Don't do it," a voice in Ariston's head said. It sounded a lot like his ex-wife. "Not your circus, not your monkeys. You have Maya." Ariston looked back at the counter. The $18. He didn't feel a sudden rush of warmth. He didn't feel a heroic calling. He felt profoundly, intensely annoyed. He was tired. His back hurt. He wanted to go to his drafty apartment, pour a bowl of chalky marshmallows for his kid in the morning, and sleep for 4 hours before his second job. "How much for a cab to the city?" Ariston asked, his voice gravelly, startling even himself. The woman turned to him, startled. "What?" "To the city. The nearest taxi dispatch is in Oak Creek. It's a 20-minute ride. Ariston stared at the $18 on the counter. Dave, ring her a cab. Ariston, man, you don't gotta. Ring it, Dave. The woman stepped forward. She smelled of wet wool, mud, and underneath that, something sharp and floral. Expensive perfume trying to mask the scent of swamp water. I just need to get to a phone. I can pay you back. 10-fold. 100-fold. I just need to get out of here. Ariston hated when people made promises like that. It sounded like a con. The desperate always promised the world when they had nothing in their pockets. Cab's gonna be about $15, Dave said, picking up the yellow plastic phone behind the register. Ariston looked at his money. He slid the 2 $5 bills and a handful of the ones across the counter. He was left with a single $5 bill and a handful of coins. Not enough for the milk and the cereal. He slid the milk back toward Dave. Put it back. Ariston, just ring the cab. Ariston picked up the box of cereal and the remaining $5 bill. He walked past the woman. He didn't smile at her. He didn't offer a comforting nod. Wait, she said, reaching out but stopping before she touched his damp jacket. Your name, please. What is your name? Ariston pushed the glass door open. The cold wind hit his face like a wet towel. Don't worry about it, he said, stepping out into the dark. He didn't look back. He just felt the hollow ache in his stomach grow sharper. He had $13 left, no milk, and a sickening feeling that he had just been played by an addict with a good story. The apartment smelled like old onions and damp drywall. Ariston turned the key in the deadbolt, wincing as the lock caught and ground against the frame. He had to lift the door by the handle to get it to click shut. The silence of the living room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, wet cough of the radiator in the corner. He walked into the tiny kitchenette, the linoleum peeling at the corners, and set the cereal box on the Formica counter. It looked pathetic. A brightly colored cardboard box sitting under the harsh, flickering glare of the single overhead bulb. He walked down the narrow hallway to the bedroom. The door was cracked open. Inside, a small lump was buried under a faded quilt. Maya was asleep. Her breathing was steady, a soft whistle pushing through her slightly parted lips. Ariston stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Guilt, thick and acidic, crept up his throat. What the hell had he done? He backed out of the room, closing the door softly, and walked to the bathroom. He turned on the sink. The pipes shuddered, spitting out brown water for a few seconds before it ran clear, but freezing cold. He splashed his face, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He looked 10 years older than 32. Deep grooves bracketed his mouth. Dark bags hung under his eyes like bruised fruit. Idiot, he whispered to the glass. He had given away the grocery money. He had given away the buffer. Poverty wasn't just a lack of money. It was a tightrope walk over a canyon. You calculated every step. You knew exactly how many slices of bread were left, how many squirts of dish soap. He had just thrown away his balance pole for a stranger who had probably taken that cab straight to a dealer or a warm motel room he could never afford. He didn't sleep. He sat on the thrift store sofa, listening to the wind rattle the loose pane in the living room window. He tried to do the math in his head. If he skipped lunch for the next 3 days, he could maybe afford a small carton of milk and some eggs by Thursday. Maya could have water with her cereal. It wasn't the end of the world. But it felt like a failure. It felt like he was drowning her, inch by inch. Morning came grey and bruised. The alarm buzzed at 6 a.m. Ariston was already up. He went to the kitchen and filled a plastic bowl with the cheap cereal. He turned on the tap, filled a glass with water, and set it next to the bowl. Maya padded into the kitchen 10 minutes later. Her hair was a tangled bird's nest, and she was dragging a stuffed rabbit by its worn ear. "Morning, Bug," Ariston said, trying to force a lightness into his voice that he didn't feel. "Where's the milk?" Maya asked, climbing onto the wobbly stool. She didn't sound whiny, just observant. Kids learned not to ask for too much when they saw the tired look in their parents' eyes. "Ran out, sweetheart. Store was closed by the time I got off." It was a lie. It tasted worse than the cereal. "Water today. Or I can make you some tea?" "Water's fine." She poured a little into the bowl. The marshmallows instantly turned slimy. She ate in silence, her small jaw working methodically. Ariston watched her, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles were white. He hated himself in that moment more than he hated his boss, more than he hated the landlord, more than he hated the cold. He was a terrible father, a sucker, a weak man who couldn't even protect his daughter's breakfast. By 9 a.m., the apartment was freezing. The radiator had given up completely. Ariston was under the kitchen sink with a wrench, trying to fix a persistent drip that was driving up the water bill. His knuckles were scraped, bleeding sluggishly. He smelled like rust and mold. He tightened a bolt, grunting as the wrench slipped and cracked against the pipe. He swore softly, dropping his head against the damp cabinet floor. Then he heard the low, synchronized hum. It wasn't a sound that belonged on his street. His street sounded like backfiring sedans, screaming matches, and the squeal of failing brakes. This sound was deep, throaty, and impeccably tuned. It was the sound of heavy, expensive machinery moving slowly. Ariston slid out from under the sink, wiping grease on his jeans. He walked to the living room window, pushing aside the yellowed curtain. His breath hitched in his throat. 5 vehicles. They moved like a slow-moving predator creeping into a den. 5 matte black SUVs, the kind with heavily tinted windows and reinforced chassis. They were massive, eating up the narrow, potholed street of the apartment complex. They didn't park on the street. They turned, crawling in unison into the cramped, cracked asphalt of the complex's parking lot. They took up the entire courtyard. Ariston's heart slammed against his ribs. A frantic, caged bird. His mind raced through a Rolodex of panic. Debt collectors. No, they didn't drive cars that cost more than the building. Child Protective Services. His blood ran cold. Had a teacher noticed the worn shoes? The watery cereal? Did someone call them? But CPS drove beat-up sedans, not tactical convoys. The landlord. No, Greg was cheap. He drove a rusted truck. The engines cut off in near-perfect unison. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Doors began to open. Men stepped out. They were broad-shouldered, wearing dark suits that didn't look like they were bought off a rack. They moved with quiet, terrifying efficiency, taking up positions around the vehicles. They weren't looking at the building. They were looking outward, scanning the street. "Daddy," Ariston jumped. Maya was standing in the hallway, clutching her rabbit. She was staring at the window, her eyes wide. "Go to your room, Maya," Ariston said, his voice tight. "Who are they?" "I said go to your room. Now, close the door." He didn't mean to snap, but the raw terror in his chest bled into his tone. Maya flinched, then hurried down the hall, the door clicking shut behind her. Ariston backed away from the window. He looked around for a weapon. His eyes landed on a heavy cast-iron pan on the stove. It was ridiculous. If these men wanted him, a pan wasn't going to stop them. But his hand went to it anyway, gripping the cold handle. He heard footsteps on the exterior metal stairs, heavy, ascending. Clack, clack, clack. They were coming to the second floor, coming to his door. Ariston stood in the center of the living room. The air in the apartment felt sucked out. He couldn't breathe. He squeezed the pan handle until his hand shook. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door. 3 raps. Ariston didn't move. "Ariston Pendleton," a voice called out from the other side. It was male, deep and smooth. "Open the door, please." They knew his name. His stomach dropped into his boots. How did they know his name? He hadn't given it to anyone. He hadn't told the woman at the gas station. He had paid with his debit card for the initial attempt at groceries before cancelling it. Dave had called him by his name. She had heard. "I'm armed," Ariston lied, his voice cracking. He sounded pathetic. "Whatever you want, I don't have it." "Mr. Pendleton, we mean you no harm," the voice responded, calm and entirely unfazed. "My employer would like a word. She is waiting in the hallway." She. Ariston swallowed hard. He slowly lowered the pan, resting it on the edge of the sofa. He walked to the door. His legs felt like lead. He reached out, his trembling fingers hovering over the deadbolt. He turned it. It ground loudly. He pulled the handle, opening the door an inch, leaving the chain engaged. A man in a charcoal suit stood there. He looked like he could punch through a brick wall. But he took a step back, clearing the frame. Behind him stood the woman from the gas station. Ariston stared. It was her, but it wasn't. The mud was gone. The ruined coat was gone. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat over a crisp white blouse. Her hair was blown out, sleek and dark. Her skin wasn't pale and terrified. It was flushed and commanded attention. The only thing that remained the same were her eyes. They were still wide, looking at him with a strange, intense focus. She smelled of the same expensive perfume, but this time it wasn't masking the scent of swamp water. It filled the dingy hallway, suffocating the smell of mildew. "Ariston," she said. Her voice was steady now. "Wealthy. Who are you?" Ariston whispered through the crack in the door. "My name is Evelyn Reed," she said. She looked past him, into the bleak, dark apartment. Her gaze caught on the broken radiator, the peeling linoleum, the general decay of a life lived on the absolute edge. A flicker of something crossed her face. Not pity, something sharper. "You gave me $18 last night. I gave you 15 for a cab," Ariston corrected defensively, his grip tightening on the door. "Look, if you're a drug dealer or something, I don't want any part of this. I don't want my money back. Just go away." Evelyn Reed let out a short, breathy laugh that held no humor. "I'm the CEO of Reed Vanguard. Real estate, logistics, technology. Last night, someone ran my driver off the road. They took my bags, my phone, and left me in the mud. I walked 3 miles in the freezing rain to that gas station. Ariston just stared at her. The words weren't computing. CEO. Logistics. I asked 5 people for help before you walked in, Evelyn continued, stepping closer to the door. 2 of them laughed at me. 1 told me to get a job. The cashier told me to leave. You were the only one who didn't look at me like I was garbage. And I saw you. Saw what? I saw you put the milk back. Her voice dropped, losing its boardroom polish, becoming raw and quiet. You didn't have enough for both. You chose to give a stranger a ride instead of buying milk for your own home. Why? Ariston felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck. He felt exposed, humiliated. He didn't want this rich woman analyzing his poverty. He didn't want her pity. Because I'm an idiot, Ariston spat back, the resentment flaring up, hot and bright. Because I was tired, and I wanted you to stop crying so I could go home. It wasn't charity. It was exhaustion. So if you're here to give me a medal, don't bother. Go back to your mansion and leave us alone. He moved to slam the door. Evelyn reached out, placing a manicured hand flat against the cheap wood. She didn't push hard, but the man in the charcoal suit immediately stepped forward, his hand drifting toward his jacket. Evelyn raised a finger, stopping him instantly. I know it wasn't charity, Ariston, she said softly, looking him dead in the eye. Charity is easy. People write checks for charity all the time because it makes them feel good. What you did didn't make you feel good. It hurt you. I saw it on your face. You hated doing it, but you did it anyway. That's not charity. That's character. She withdrew her hand from the door and reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. It was pure white, sealed with a wax stamp. I don't want your money, Ariston said, though his eyes locked onto the envelope. It looked thick. Too thick. It's not money, Evelyn said. Well, not exactly. It's a contract. A contract for what? For whatever you want it to be. A job, a house, a future. She held it out, sliding it through the narrow gap left by the chain lock. I owe you a debt, Ariston Pendleton, and I do not leave debts unpaid. Open it. Read it. My card is inside. If you want to keep living like this, throw it away. But if you want to fix the radiator, she glanced over his shoulder, and buy some real milk for whoever is hiding in that bedroom, you'll call me. Ariston stood frozen. He looked at the envelope. It was hovering in the air, a white flag in the middle of a war zone. He didn't want to take it. His pride screamed at him to shut the door in her face. He hated her perfect coat and her perfect cars, and the fact that she could swoop in and solve his life with a piece of paper. It felt deeply unfair. But then he heard it. The soft, stifled cough from Maya's bedroom down the hall. The anger drained out of him, leaving only the crushing weight of reality. Pride didn't pay the heating bill. Pride tasted like chalky marshmallows and tap water. Ariston reached out. His fingers were still trembling, stained with grease and dried blood from the sink. He took the envelope. It felt heavy. It smelled like expensive paper and that sharp floral perfume. Thank you, he mumbled, hating the way his voice broke. Evelyn didn't smile. She just gave him a slow, solemn nod. No, Ariston. Thank you. She turned on her heel, her trench coat flaring slightly. She walked back down the metal stairs, the sound of her heels entirely different from the heavy boots of her security detail. Ariston closed the door. He locked the deadbolt. He stood in the silent, freezing apartment, staring at the wax seal on the envelope, the sound of 5 massive engines roaring to life outside, rattling the windows in their frames. The wax seal crumbled between Ariston's calloused thumbs. It felt brittle, breaking into dark red flakes that scattered across the scratched surface of his kitchen table. Inside the envelope were 2 items. The first was a cashier's check. The paper was heavy, watermarked, with a faint, sterile smell of fresh ink. Ariston stared at the numbers. He read them left to right, then right to left, his brain refusing to stitch them together into a coherent reality. $180,000, exactly 10,000 times what he had given Dave for the cab. The second item was a legal document, stapled neatly in the corner. Employment agreement, logistics director, Northeast Division. Base salary, $165,000. Ariston didn't jump out of his chair. He didn't scream or cry or fall to his knees thanking God. He sat perfectly still, listening to the drip of the leaky faucet he hadn't fully fixed. A slow, creeping nausea coiled in his stomach. It was too much. It was violently out of proportion. When you spend your entire adult life measuring existence in quarters, the cost of a load of laundry, the price difference between store-brand bread and the name brand, a number like $180,000 doesn't register as relief. It registers as a threat. It felt like a trap. It felt like a mistake that someone in a suit would eventually come to correct, demanding the money back with interest he couldn't pay. He slid the check and the contract back into the envelope. He walked into his bedroom, pried up the loose floorboard under the radiator, and shoved the envelope into the dusty darkness between the joists. Then he put on his steel-toed boots, kissed a sleeping Maya on the forehead, and went to his shift at the fulfillment center. The warehouse smelled of corrugated cardboard, hot rubber, and diesel exhaust. It was a sensory assault that usually numbed his brain, allowing him to survive the grueling 12-hour shifts. Today, the noise was deafening. The hydraulic whine of the forklifts grated against his spine. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a manic, flickering energy. Ariston stood at station 42, scanning barcodes. Beep, tape, slide. Beep, tape, slide. His hands moved with practiced muscle memory, but his mind was back under the floorboards of his apartment. "Pendleton, you're dragging!" The voice cut through the industrial hum. Gary, the floor supervisor. Gary was a man who wore his meager authority like a loaded weapon. He had a red, perpetually sweaty face and breathed heavily through his nose. Ariston looked up. He was holding a box of ceramic mugs. "Your scan rate is down 12% this hour," Gary barked, tapping the cracked screen of his tablet. "You sleeping with your eyes open? We have quotas, Ariston. You want to keep your hours this week, you pick up the pace. There's a dozen guys waiting outside who take your spot in a heartbeat." Usually this was the part where Ariston nodded, where he swallowed the bile in his throat, apologized, and moved his aching hands faster. The fear of losing the job was the invisible collar around his neck, choking him into submission. But as Ariston looked at Gary's red, wet face, he felt something strange. An absence. The collar was gone. He thought about the piece of paper under his floorboard. $180,000. He could buy this entire section of the warehouse. He could pay Gary's salary for 3 years. Ariston didn't smile. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt a profound, exhausting emptiness. He looked at the barcode scanner in his hand. The plastic was worn smooth from thousands of hours of desperate, repetitive labor. "Did you hear me, Pendleton?" Gary snapped, stepping closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. Ariston set the scanner down on the metal table. The quiet clack of the plastic hitting the steel sounded louder to him than the forklifts. "Yeah, I heard you, Gary." "Then get moving." Ariston looked at him. Really looked at him. Gary wasn't a monster. He was just another terrified man pushing downward so he wouldn't get crushed from above. It was all a machine, and they were all just gears grinding each other into dust. "I'm going to take my lunch," Ariston said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual subservient edge. Gary blinked, thrown off by the tone. "It's 10:30. Lunch isn't until noon. You walk away from this station. I'm writing you up." "Write me up." Ariston turned and walked down the concrete aisle. He didn't look back. He didn't quit in a blaze of glory. He didn't flip Gary off. He just walked away, feeling the ache in his left leg, wondering why having a fortune under his bed didn't make his joints stop hurting. He sat in the break room for the rest of his shift, staring at the vending machine. He didn't buy anything. When the clock struck 6, he punched out and walked into the cold evening air. He had survived the day, but the dread in his chest had only grown. The money was real, which meant he had to do something about it. The bank was a terrifying place. It was located downtown, miles away from Ariston's neighborhood. The floor was polished marble that reflected the recessed lighting. The air was climate-controlled, smelling of lemon polish and expensive cologne. Ariston stood in line. He wore his only clean jeans and his work jacket. He could feel the security guard's eyes tracking him. He could feel the slight shift in posture from the woman in the cashmere sweater standing in front of him. He was a stain on their pristine environment. When it was his turn, he walked up to the bulletproof glass. The teller, a woman with a severe haircut and a nameplate that read Diane, offered a tight, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How can I help you today?" Ariston reached into his jacket. He pulled out the envelope. His fingers left a slight smudge of grease on the pristine white paper. He slid the cashier's check under the metal slot. Diane looked at it. Her eyes flicked down to the amount, then snapped up to Ariston's face. The professional smile vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating squint. She looked at his bruised knuckles, his tired eyes, the frayed collar of his jacket. "Do you have an account with us, sir?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into a defensive register. "No." "I see." She tapped her manicured nails on the desk. "A check of this size, drawn from a corporate account, we usually require a holding period, and frankly, sir, I need to verify this." "Verify it," Ariston said. His voice was steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. He felt like a criminal. He felt like he had stolen it, even though it was given to him. This was the reality of being poor. You were guilty until proven wealthy. Diane picked up a phone. She murmured into it, her eyes never leaving Ariston. A few minutes later, a man in a tailored suit emerged from a back office. The branch manager. He approached the window, inspected the check, and then looked at Ariston. "Mr. Pendleton?" the manager asked. "Yes. This check is issued by Reed Vanguard. It's drawn directly from the CEO's private holdings. The manager's tone was a mix of intense skepticism and fearful reverence for the name. "Can I ask the nature of your business with Ms. Reed?" Ariston wanted to say. "I bought her a $15 cab ride because she was crying at a gas station." Instead, he looked the manager dead in the eye. "No, you can't. Just tell me if the check is good." The manager held Ariston's gaze for a long moment. Then his posture shifted. The aggression melted away, replaced by the subservience that money buys. He nodded to Diane. "It's good. Clear it." 30 minutes later, Ariston walked out of the bank. He didn't have a briefcase full of cash. He had a new account, a black debit card burning a hole in his pocket, and $500 in cash. He didn't go to Dave's gas station. He drove his sputtering Honda to a massive, sprawling supermarket in the suburbs. The automatic doors parted with a quiet swish. The blast of warm air smelled like baking bread, roasted chicken, and fresh flowers. Ariston stood at the entrance, overwhelmed. The aisles stretched on for miles, brightly lit, bursting with impossible colors. He grabbed a cart. The wheels didn't squeak. They glided smoothly over the polished floor. He walked to the dairy aisle. He stood before the wall of glass doors. There were dozens of types of milk: skim, oat, almond, soy. He opened the door, the cold air hitting his face. He bypassed the store-brand gallons. He reached for a glass bottle of organic, cream-top, whole milk. It was $7. He put it in the cart. He went to the produce section. He bought apples that weren't bruised. He bought a carton of strawberries that smelled like actual fruit, not damp plastic. He went to the meat counter and pointed at a thick cut of steak. By the time he reached the checkout, his cart was full. The total was $214. The cashier didn't look at him with pity. She just bagged the groceries, handed him the receipt, and told him to have a good day. When Ariston returned to the apartment, it was still freezing. The money in his pocket hadn't magically fixed the radiator. The peeling linoleum was still peeling. The smell of old onions still lingered in the wallpaper. Maya was sitting on the thrift store sofa, drawing with a broken crayon. "Hey, Bug," Ariston said, hauling the heavy paper bags onto the kitchen counter. "You're home early," she said, looking up. "Yeah, I am." He started unpacking the bags. Maya slid off the sofa and padded into the kitchenette, her eyes widening as the items piled up on the counter. The strawberries, the glass bottle of milk, a fresh loaf of bread. "Are we having a party?" she asked, her voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly would make the food disappear. Ariston felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. A party? Because he bought groceries. "No, sweetheart, just dinner." He turned on the stove. He unwrapped the steak. He dropped a heavy pat of real, salted butter into the cast-iron pan. It sizzled instantly, a rich, nutty aroma filling the tiny, cold kitchen, warring with the smell of damp drywall. He cooked the steak. He poured a large glass of the thick, white milk. He set a plate down on the wobbly stool for Maya. She climbed up. She picked up the glass with both hands, taking a slow sip. She paused, pulling the glass away from her mouth. "It tastes different," she whispered. "It's the good stuff," Ariston said, leaning back against the counter, crossing his arms to hide the slight tremor in his hands. He watched her eat. She didn't devour it like a starving animal. She ate carefully, savoring the richness of the meat, the sweetness of the strawberries. Ariston didn't eat. He just watched her, the knot in his stomach slowly untangling, replaced by a terrifying sense of gravity. The canyon was filled in, but now he had to figure out how to walk on solid ground. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crisp white business card that had been in the envelope. Black text on thick, textured paper. Just a name and a phone number. He pulled out his cracked cell phone and dialed. It rang twice before she answered. Pendleton. Her voice was sharp, clear, and businesslike. No pleasantries. You track caller ID too? Ariston asked, looking out the frost-covered window at the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I run a logistics empire, Ariston. I track everything. A pause. Did you cash it? I did. Good. And the contract? Ariston looked at the wax seal remnants still on the table. Logistics Director, Northeast Division. I don't have a college degree, Ms. Reed. I've been scanning boxes for 8 years. I don't know the first thing about running a division. I have a building full of people with MBAs who don't know the first thing about reality. Evelyn's voice snapped back, sharp and uncompromising. I don't need another suit who only looks at spreadsheets. I need someone who knows what it feels like on the floor. I need someone who understands the cost of a delay because they've had to skip meals because of it. I need someone who won't lie to me to save their own skin. Ariston listened to the hum of the refrigerator. And if I fail, he asked, then I'll fire you, Evelyn said evenly. The money repays the debt. The job is on you. I'm not a charity, Ariston. I don't hand out sinecures. You'll work 100 hours a week. You'll hate me most days, but you will never have to put the milk back again. Ariston looked at Maya. She had milk on her upper lip, a white mustache. She caught him looking and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that he hadn't seen in months. When do I start? Ariston asked. Monday, 7 a.m. Wear a tie. And Ariston? Yeah. Don't thank me. Wasn't planning on it. Ariston hung up the phone. He slid it back into his pocket. He walked over to the wobbly stool, grabbed a paper napkin, and gently wiped the milk mustache from his daughter's face. The apartment was still cold. The sink was still leaking. But as Ariston listened to the sizzle of the butter in the pan, he knew they wouldn't be here much longer. The rust was finally washing away. Ariston's journey proves that true character isn't forged in moments of glory, but in the quiet, exhausting choices we make when we have absolutely nothing left to give. Sometimes, a single painful sacrifice can rewrite your entire future. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that raw kindness still matters. Subscribe for more grounded, emotional stories every single week. What would you have done with your last $18? Tell us below.